Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by Irene Ilachinski, licensed clinical social worker, to discuss ADHD in mothers. Hi, Irene. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We're excited for you to be here. This is going to be such a great topic, something that I think a lot of people may be experiencing and don't know, or have recently found out they have this diagnosis and they want more information on. So this is going to be a great discussion today.
I'm glad to hear that. I look forward to it too.
Yeah. So Irene, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay. Well, I am a therapist in private practice in Fairfax City, Virginia, and I mainly work with people who have chronic or acute PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And I also am informed in ADHD, especially in adult women who are very bright and high functioning, but also have attention deficit disorder.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you're in the Fairfax area. The Fairfax area. And if people are going to go find you online to seek your services or anything, where would they go?
Yes, so they can look on my website, which is www.openbridgescounseling.com. And that's all one word, openbridgescounseling.com.
Perfect. Alrighty. I'll link that in the show notes so folks can find you on your website.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Well, let's just hop into all these questions here.
Okay.
So first and foremost, I think the signs might be a good thing to start with. So what are some signs that mothers see that lead them to maybe believe that they've got ADHD?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And I do work with a number of mothers in my practice, women who are parents. And so the most common thing that women will tell me is, I've had these signs, I've known this about me, but it really didn't come together for me personally until my children were diagnosed. So their own children seems to be the biggest gateway to them being diagnosed.
Right.
And what they'll often tell me is, so my kid has, they brought them in because they might have trouble focusing, they were having trouble completing assignments, depending on which subtype of ADHD challenges they had, or they were talking too much in class, couldn't sit still. And then the parents get brought in and they have that meeting and they're like, and so I was sitting there in the chair with the teacher and with the social worker, and we talked about next steps. And as they were telling me the kind of challenges my child has and the kind of struggles my child said they had, I started thinking, wow, that was a lot like me in school. That's a lot like how I remembered I was. And that's the most common gateway for parents to be diagnosed.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
We have definitely seen a similar thing at RLLC where parents are like, oh yeah, I had that similar struggle, but I never knew that was me, why I was struggling, especially with dyslexia or stuff like that. So definitely makes
sense. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And I think also the issue too is that our generation, I want to say my generation and also millennials and up, I want to say, often we didn't get diagnosed in school. And I don't even know how much the girls with ADHD are getting diagnosed in school anyway, because what often happens is that and they've done many studies on this, that it is likely that women and girls are underdiagnosed anyway. They miss the diagnosis in school because, and I'm getting into, I guess, some of the gender disparities. And I'm not saying this is true for all girls or all boys, but more typically, boys, the gateway to boys being diagnosed is that they are more likely to have the hyperactive subtype. And they are just as likely as girls to have the inattentive subtype. There's 3 subtypes: inattentive, impulsive, and hyperactive. And then there's something called the combined subtype, which can be someone's impulsive and hyperactive, for example.
Gotcha.
And so the boys are the more likely ones to be diagnosed because they have symptoms that are making them somewhat disruptive to the classroom. they're talking a lot. They're reaching their body over, grabbing the other kid's stuff. They might have outbursts. Sometimes they can be a little oppositional, but they're doing things that are kind of causing issues for the teacher. So there's an incentive, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but there's an incentive to get services for this boy because they want this to be less of a problem in school. Right. Whereas the girl might be the more quietly inattentive daydreamer. And so she's not being disruptive. So she might miss what's going on. She might not get the highest test scores, but it might not be that the school is pushing for testing or saying there's something here that we need looked at.
Right.
And so a lot of women my age especially and this wasn't even a thing that was really understood unless you were so hyperactive that the expression that's often used is bouncing off the walls. And then these are the kids that are flagged more often early. And whereas the one who might be a little impulsive, and that might show up in girls more typically as though they're very talkative. They talk a lot. They're known as doing that, where the boys might have more physical impulsivity, grabbing things, pushing somebody. Again, I'm making massive stereotypes. I'm not saying a girl can't be physically impulsive or hyperactive. And I'm certainly not saying a boy can't be inattentive. Right. It's just that these are things we might see more often. And girls and boys can they both seem to have the inattentive at roughly the same rates. This is of people who've been diagnosed. Oh. And I don't want to botch the research, but that's my understanding. But it is far more likely that the boy will have the hyperactive diagnosis as the subtype than the girl.
That's so interesting. And I do feel like I've heard some of that in some of the dyslexia like seminars and things that we have provided like from as RLC, where a similar thing happens that the girls will like go kind of under the radar a little bit because boys have the hyperactive kind of character trait in the classroom. And so, like you said, kind of seen as the disruption, which isn't really fair to both the kids, right? Because it's like their learning is being disrupted, right? Regardless of how it is being disrupted. So it's just an interesting like thing to hear that this similar thing happens with ADHD.
Yeah, that's a good point too about the dyslexia. And of course, there are a lot of speculations about why this is. And we can also get into gender roles and societal expectations. Right. I did hear one doctor years ago talk about that when the girl is having some of these struggles, they'll say, well, you're not great in school, but you'll be a nice wife someday. That's right. Okay. You're just going to get married. And and here she is. There are still executive functions, no matter whether you're working outside the home or in the home. Right. Life has its demands, and you might struggle with these demands. But there was this assumption that, well, it's more of a trait. You're just kind of a spacey person. That some of the ADHD tendencies were seen more as traits in girls. She's spacey. She's talkative. Whereas with boys, they were more likely to identify, oh, there's a challenge here. We got to look at that more carefully. So who knows? The good news is there's more awareness, and it looks like the rates of diagnosis in girls is increasing. I don't necessarily see that as a negative. That might be a positive because I think for way too long, women have been underdiagnosed. Right. And to me, diagnosis, I look at it as a compass. Yeah. It's not a judgment. It's not, it shouldn't be a label or a judgment. It can unfortunately be used that way by some people, but I see it as what is the cluster of symptoms that we want to treat, that we want to address, that we want to give resources to so that your life can be more satisfying and you can feel like you're not struggling so much. Yeah. So that's awesome. How I see diagnosis.
That's a great way to see diagnosis.
Yeah, it helps me.
Yeah. And it takes the stigma out of it, right? It's like, hey, you know what I mean? If you needed a Band-Aid for your finger, right, you're going to go like seek out that solution, but there isn't a judgment to the fact that you have a cut, right? It's just, you're seeking out the assistance for the not even problem, but for the thing that has happened.
Sure. For the challenge, the issue. And right. I think Dr. Ned Hollowell talks about that, that he talks about the ADHD brain. And his book, Driven to Distraction, is a really excellent one because it really goes into the experience of what it's like for children and for adults who might have, let's say, ADHD with other comorbid conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So, like a day in the life of a woman, let's say, with ADHD and depression,
Mm-hmm.
a day in the life of a woman with ADHD and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the book that a lot of parents say they read and they'll say, oh my gosh, that's me.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's me. And so um, they look back on their life. And again, because it was just something they learned to deal with, they
Yeah.
develop compensatory strategies.
Mm.
And but oftentimes, to answer that question, for mothers, their child is the gateway diagnosis person.
Right. And so once they've got that kind of like gateway to the diagnosis, how do they even start that process? And do you normally see like a general age range that adult women get diagnosed with ADHD?
Yeah. So I think that now women are getting diagnosed younger, but
Okay.
most typically women at this point, most frequently the age of diagnosis, not the age of onset. I want to be clear, it's very different,
Right.
but the age on average which they get formally diagnosed is usually ranges between their late 30s and early 40s,
Wow.
which is consistent with years at which they're parenting school age children, most
Right.
of all. Um, and often, here's the other thing, it's rare, or it has been rare, that a woman will come into therapy or a psychiatrist or however she enters the mental health system. She rarely presents saying ADHD is her main problem.
Mm.
She'll usually come in presenting with anxiety or depression.
Okay.
And that's where the therapists or behavioral health psychiatrist, psychologist, whoever it is, that's where their own expertise or intuition or ability to recognize and ask questions is very critical because
Mm.
they might miss the ADHD altogether. A woman
Right.
can get treated once she presents with that, and she should be. I'm not saying she
Yeah.
shouldn't, but we want to treat depression and diagnosis first because those are kind of the first line symptoms that she's presenting with. But often there's an underlying ADHD
Mm.
issue going on that is being missed,
Right.
especially if the clinicians, if that's not their focus, that's just not what they were looking at, or the woman is just dealing with so much of the overwhelm, the
Mm.
anxiety, and those are some of the key words. If they identify with the idea, just my life feels so overwhelming, it feels chaotic, I can't get organized, things like that, and then they get anxious, and the overwhelm can lead to kind of these feelings of burnout.
Right.
I'm a failure. I'm just not cutting it. Depression. And so they're usually presenting with those other symptoms, the depression, anxiety, rather than
Okay.
the underlying ADHD as being one of the main things that's fueling those things.
Right. And so then do they come to a psychiatrist and get that like I guess how do they come into a psychiatrist's office and say like I think I might have ADHD? Is that normally what happens for them to get that diagnosis? Or is it just that you come in and say I need something super thorough because I'm feeling all of these things?
Sure. And that's a good question. I do know that when they come into me, sometimes they'll tell me, I think I might have ADHD. And I should say that I'm a therapist. So
Right.
it's usually more often their clinical presentation that will lead me to think that. And given the cluster of what they're telling me. And then I
Right.
will do some assessments, just basic assessments that rely more on self assessments, interviews. Now, if they want to get a formal diagnosis with a, someone that can give a very refined
Mm.
testing experience, like we're talking hours and days of really clinically valid and reliable testing,
Right.
that would be with a neuropsychologist.
Okay.
That's not usually how they come in um, to get diagnosed, just because usually it's somebody who refers them to the neuropsych for that kind of testing. But
Gotcha.
if they come into me, they'll tell me, I do feel overwhelmed, I feel scattered. And more often they are feeling anxious because of that. So,
Right.
oh my gosh, and they might have had that their whole lives, right? What did I miss? What did I forget? I'm always feeling like that. A very common experience is they'll tell me, I just feel like I'm putting up a front all the time, which is what we would call imposter syndrome. They'll feel imposter syndrome, like I'm kind of pretending to be good at this, but if only people knew, like that I'm struggling, that deep down I'm feeling chaotic. That can be a flag that there's some hidden struggle, and ADHD can be one. There can be others, but it can be a process of them seeing, and often they'll say they experienced this in childhood too. It's not like life always felt organized and orderly, and then suddenly it got chaotic. That can happen, but it's more often when they look back and somebody who's really doing a good clinical interview and as they're reporting, and sometimes we'll have family members come in too and say what their experiences of this person. And they will talk about, certain things are more of a struggle. And some of the hallmarks of the ADHD, kind of the core symptoms that we would say, there can be a hard time regulating emotions because some of the ADHD experience is that emotions come on very strong. And there's also something called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which was only labeled a thing or recognized as a thing in the last few years. And it's called RSD. And rejection sensitive dysphoria is a condition that is very more often centered with ADHD. And people can feel, let's say, strong negative emotions come on. They'll say like a tidal wave, like a slap in the face. And whether it's real or perceived rejection, like somebody might have said something off the cuff, oh, you're such a space cadet, or they'll say, well, you're not that organized, or they'll laugh at them. And the person will experience such a sense of just shame or feeling criticized that, and it can take them a while to get back to baseline. And so that can be a real struggle. And, and if women have that kind of thing, kids, but also women might have dealt with that their whole lives. And they'll say, well, I know, and they'll come in and they say, I think maybe I'm too sensitive. And they'll often say that, like, I'm too, well, we know that the RSD, or rejection sensitive dysphoria, or hard time regulating your emotions, it's there. And noticing that you might have more sensitivity than others might be helpful, and saying, wow, what's going on? But we want to validate, that's not going to help you feel not sensitive, right? Okay, so you've noticed sensitivities, but that is one of the core traits and sometimes regulating the emotions. When I'm angry, it goes from 0 to 100, takes a while to get back down. And another core trait can be, or core symptom can be impulsivity. And that, like I say, that can come out with like, and in adults, it can look like you have trouble waiting your turn. You interrupt others. You talk a lot. It's a hard time stopping. You might also miss social cues, like the idea somebody's tapping their foot, rolling their eyes, or you might see it when they're really rolling their eyes because they're that frustrated. And people, women with ADHD, can be very sensitive to that kind of thing. And so they might compensate by avoiding social situations, by isolating more than others. And sometimes they'll say, I'm afraid that, I might then do something to sabotage things or blow up. Or I just might say the wrong thing. And they often have that anxiety, like they don't know what they did. They don't know. And that can be a difficult experience. And then the other core trait of ADHD can be trouble focusing. So, and that can be like, so attention deficit, though, can be a misnomer. So, some people might have trouble staying focused, like they'll, and that's why they say inattentive. So, the teacher, or your, like, since we're talking about adults, someone is talking and you zone out and you miss what they said. And then people are like, aren't you listening to me? And they think you don't care about that. So that can lead to social problems too. But sometimes people with ADHD also have the opposite situation, where they can really hyper focus on something, especially if they find it very interesting. And that can be a gift because they can really get into something that's their passion. It can be a little hard, though, when they miss the stimulus to transition to the next activity. So those are 3 core traits. that are involved in ADHD and
Yeah.
the way it manifests in women.
Okay.
At least something to look for.
Yeah. So then once, a mother or like adult gets this new diagnosis, what happens? I guess we're speaking specifically for mothers here. What happens to
Yeah.
like the family dynamic? Like how does that kind of affect the other folks in the family?
Yeah. So I'm going to say that when they get diagnosed, oftentimes what people will tell me is for them, it was a relief to get the
Yeah.
diagnosis. Initially, it's very validating.
Yeah.
The initial feeling is, oh my gosh, it was this all this time. I've sensed this and this all makes sense now.
Right.
And in terms of how it affects the family, that's really going to depend on how the family is able to view this. Because if they can view the diagnosis as something that is a helpful thing, just
Right.
like your analogy with the cut on the finger, right?
Right.
Um, this is a condition we have. And if we can be accepting about it and say, what's going to help us work with the brains we have, um, and we have that collaborative accepting approach, the family usually will function better.
Right.
And in my experience, once the woman is getting the resources that she needs to help, which can be a combination of many things,
Mhm.
then she's often going to be struggling less and going to have far less anxiety and depression and be able to be more accepting and present. And in turn, that can make her um, a more, I would say, a more joyful or definitely a less stressed out parent because
Right.
she's not carrying around these expectations and shame and struggling in the same way.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah.
Everybody sees these symptoms. We know what they are. Now we can name them and we can all function as a family.
Right.
So, if anything, it's often, in my experience, very positive.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and I encourage the spouses and other adults in the family to not take a punitive approach with it
Yeah.
or not look at it through the lens of there's something wrong with you. Because if we
Right.
can look at it, this is how you are. What's going to help us all and what's going to help you
Right.
function as best as you can. That's
Yeah.
going to be the most positive approach.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what are the strategies that you have either suggested or that you've seen people like use to manage their ADHD once they've, kind of gotten all of that not gotten it under control, but gotten the diagnosis and
Sure.
understand where they're at?
Sure. So there's a couple of strategies. One of the things that they have found is that, um, and I know people feel differently about this, but the research backs this up, and it's what I've seen is that um, it can be a combination of therapy and or coaching
Okay.
along with stimulant medication. And
Yep.
often in adults, you want to the first line can be the stimulants actually,
Yeah.
or I should say the medications that treat ADHD. There are many that are stimulants. That was the first line,
Hmm.
because really what ADHD is, it's a number of brain processes, but mainly it's a deficit in the executive functioning part of the brain,
Right.
usually in the neurotransmitters that involve executive functioning. Most commonly, it's norepinephrine and dopamine.
Okay.
And so the stimulants help increase the activity in the frontal lobe of those neurotransmitters.
Gotcha.
So it's kind of, if we think of the frontal lobe as a traffic cop of your brain, it decides go, stop, start, uh, this is what we do. This is when
Right.
we do it. This is
Right.
how we do it. Um, and so having some of the stimulant medication, I view it as it's like eyeglasses.
Mm.
Um, it's not going to, if you can't if you have trouble reading, eyeglasses are not going to help you to read. But if the issue is that you can read, you have the comprehension, but you need the glasses to just help you focus better, the stimulants do that too, because your brain is now getting the appropriate amount of neurotransmitter to help you function through your day.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
don't know that anyone's ever explained the stimulants to me like that. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, so you're welcome. Absolutely. And the other piece I do want to say about stimulants is, and I know people feel very loaded when it comes to the idea of stimulants.
Yeah.
Now I do think pills don't teach skills.
Mhm.
And especially stimulants are not necessarily going to help with the organizational struggles that people have, like organizing things.
Right.
But it can help with maintaining mental energy and focus.
Yeah.
Um, and so uh, there are other things that people can do, and there are and also there are now more as ADHD, the understanding of it and treatment of it gets refined. There are also some non-stimulant medications that
Oh,
people can look at, and you can talk to your primary care doctor about that. And sometimes they will refer you to a psychiatrist
yeah.
if whatever they're trying isn't necessarily as effective or effective in the right way as you would want.
Right.
But the doctors will talk to people about that, which kind of stimulant can be helpful. But that's where we often will start. And then it can be a combination of um, therapy with a
Okay.
therapist who has the understanding of ADHD and some of the pitfalls and strategies, sometimes cognitive behavioral therapy,
Mm,
um, to get us talk out of that negative thinking spiral and I'm a
right.
failure, I'm not doing this right,
Right.
along with coaching. Or instead, they can try coaching if they're looking for some very directive accountability type of treatment. That would
Yeah.
be more coaching.
Okay. Well, that's great to know.
Yeah.
We talked about the age, right? So 30 to late 30s to early 40s is kind of
Hmm.
like when that diagnosis is given, like you said, not the onset, but the diagnosis. So
Yes.
what is it like for that person once they've found out so much later in their life that they've been kind of masking for ADHD all of this time, right? They've got these, like you said earlier, like compensatory skills that they've kind of
Hmm.
like used to get through school and college and just
Hmm.
general life. What happens now when they are trying to learn new skills to help them
Hmm.
compensate, or like things that are a little more better equipped to help them work through what they're doing?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first question.
Yeah.
So when someone finds out later in life that they've been masking for ADHD or that they've had it and they've been um, just dealing with it, um, and they've been trying to keep it under the radar,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they feel, like I say, the initial relief. Oh, that makes sense. And sometimes after a while, what they might start to feel is even grief or
Mm.
anger. And that's normal. That
Yeah.
it's the feeling of, oh, what my life could have been like, or
Mm.
what school could have been like if I'd have known this, if I'd have had the right treatment, the right, partly medication, but and just the right understanding of what this was.
Right.
Um, and a lot of them have had very traumatic experiences, which I'll get into later,
Yeah.
because people have often seen this under a lens which was more like a character flaw.
Mm.
And people will recount that having been, shamed or yelled at by teachers or parents or caregivers or whoever it is, or even bullied by other kids,
Yeah.
the feeling that oh, there's something wrong with me. And when they find out that it's ADHD and they finally get all the treatments, and they're often happy if they can get their kids to have the treatment, depending
Right.
on what their background is or what's informing their view. But often there is that feeling of, oh, I wish I had it.
Yeah.
And again, because the other reason I talk about treatment being so important and looking at that stimulant piece or the medication piece is that people with ADHD have a much higher risk. Some people say 2 to 3 times higher of substance abuse disorder.
Oh, wow.
And they are, we know that women with ADHD are at higher risk for anxiety and depression.
Right.
And some of that is just because so many things are more challenging than they are for neurotypical people, right? That
Right.
organization, socially fitting in. Um, but also, I think the substance abuse piece is interesting because really what you're seeing is people trying to self medicate the anxiety or the scatteredness or the restlessness or the even the depression that's coming with the ADHD, or
Right.
just trying to give themselves that dopamine hit.
Yeah.
And often what they will say to me is once they start the medication, they'll say, I haven't had the need for that afternoon coffee or to smoke as much or to blare music or to have that afternoon energy snack jolt of chocolate
Right.
because they have the medication that's helping them sustain that focus.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, but there can be that grief, and I honor that that's
Yeah.
there.
Right.
That I didn't have this, but I also look at it from the strengths perspective. Look how well you've done even without that. That says a lot about you.
Right.
But yeah, we can grieve, and it's okay to be angry as well, that
Right.
this didn't have to be as hard as it was. And
Right.
hopefully in the future, it doesn't have to be.
Right. Yeah. Is it difficult for a mother to kind of get out of the initial habits that they had
Mhm.
used to compensate and to then like change to, I don't know if the therapist is telling them like this is maybe an easier way for you to work through like a specific feeling or disorganization or anything like that? Is it hard for them to get out of the old habits?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. So let me say, for example, Lydia,
Okay.
who's a mom of two people, and then
Great.
she gets the diagnosis and she's having, because she's had a lot of anxiety, like life stress. She's very drained and exhausted. She has a child who got diagnosed. Oh my gosh, that's me. I have it. And maybe she's been working with someone for anxiety already, or started seeing a therapist for anxiety, maybe started even some medication for it. Once they find out about the ADHD piece,
Mm-hmm.
they might start the stimulant and start some therapies to deal with strategies. Um, so habits that they have picked up that are compensatory, I want to say something about that. So there are what I would call adaptive compensatory strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are they've been using strategies that have been working well for them, and they don't
Right.
necessarily need to stop doing that.
Right.
Um, and some people might do like on their own. Especially, I'll see this with the more creative and bright ADHD types. They
Yeah.
figured out that they're not very good at time management, and now we have iPhones, right? So
Yeah.
they set alarms for themselves, and they were already doing that
Yeah.
because they knew that that was helpful. So we'll say, keep doing that. Oh, by the
Right.
way, here's some other tips. You might want to set it for 1 day ahead and 2 hours ahead, or you
Right.
might want to also put this in, so they can refine those strategies. Sometimes, if their strategy was maladaptive,
Right.
that they're compensating, that might be the thing that we work on. So, a strategy that might be maladaptive, like we're saying, if they're dealing with it by smoking more, binge
Mm-hmm.
eating, substance use, those can be compensatory strategies for coping with anxiety
Right.
or that scattered, restless feeling. Those are things that might have unwanted side effects. So those are the things that we say, okay, how can we work on this and try this instead, or
Mm-hmm.
change that a little bit?
Right.
So we want to first assess if what they're doing is adaptive or helpful,
Right.
or if it's maladaptive, like it's coming with things that might be harmful to them.
Okay. Yeah,
So
that's good to
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Um, and what is your like biggest piece of advice for a mother who is just finding out that she has ADHD?
So the biggest piece of advice that I would say, um, have compassion for yourself.
Mm,
This is not a failure. This is not a weakness. I think
right.
they come in with a lot of stigma. I think that often ADHD, I see it as a condition that has a lot of strengths.
Yeah.
And we don't want to underestimate that. And at the same time, I think it's like I say, have compassion for yourself.
Yeah.
And instead of beating ourselves up for the ways that we're often feeling like we don't measure up, why is this so hard for me?
Mm,
Lydia, for instance, she's a very hard worker and always was in school. She's an honor student. Um, she might feel like some other peers have passed her by professionally.
mm,
They earn way more money, they do whatever, and she might say, you know, what's wrong with me? That's because I'm not good at stuff. Wait a minute, look at the things that you have done.
right.
And you are definitely your own best self. And you have had to work so much harder,
Yeah.
and still accomplish things. So having that compassion and that perspective for yourself is so crucial.
Yeah.
And the other piece, use the resources out there.
Yeah.
There, you don't get points for toughing it out without the help. I think that's the other piece. Um, and getting those resources, again, look at them like eyeglasses.
Right.
I would say, if one of the books that I love is Smart But Scattered by
Okay.
Kathleen Nadeau.
Yeah.
And it's a great one to, I tell people, keep it in the bathroom and just read a chapter here and there. Don't try to read the book cover to cover.
Right.
Bathroom's a great place to read, or wherever you might sit down and just read, because it's got great strategies for, I find they're great with moms. And I'll give you one nugget.
Oh,
Um, so let's say, and this is the thing with moms, right? We get drained
yeah.
because, um, the moms, they might be able to work through these strategies when they have, let's say, a job. But now you're dealing with the deadlines of a job. And now we've got to get these kids to their meetings. And if they've got their own conditions, we're dealing with shuttling IEP meetings, doctor's appointments, mail. And that can feel so overwhelming. And
Yeah.
so they can feel like they're burning out. And so, um, getting that kind of support of somebody who really gets what this experience is like for you. It's a lot more, you're doing more work than a neurotypical person in your
Right.
life. So slow down, right? Go at the pace that works for you. You're not measuring it up to some ruler in the sky. And that's what I would say. Um, and that in my experience, the people who can be accepting and look at this as an opportunity to get resources, they usually do better than the ones who try to cope with it in isolation and don't seek the help.
Wow.
So
That is,
that's really what I would say.
yeah, that is fantastic advice. We have someone who normally comes to do kind of like talks for us about like just mental health and things of that nature. And he always says, like, get rid of the stigma, just get the help. Like and he
Yes,
always like drives that point home. And so I appreciate you saying that as your piece of advice, because it is so important. And the more people hear it, I think, you know, the
absolutely.
better the outcome for everyone.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. And I think, Ned Hollowell, like I say, if you read his book, Driven to Distraction, that's a great one.
Yeah.
And what I was going to come back to, I'm sorry, I forgot to say this.
Oh, that's
The
good.
nugget that I was going to mention, one nugget in the book, ADHD Friendly Ways to Organize Your Life, they
Mhm.
talk about there is one tendency that we have called USUM, we
Oh.
meaning ADHD, the crowd,
Mhm.
the crowd I work with, out of sight, out of mind. So if we
Ah,
don't see it, we forget where it is. So, and our brains can be like that, right? It's the messy room, the messy closet. Um, and so out of sight, out of mind tends to be a thing for us. Whereas most neurotypical people will fold and organize and put things away in a drawer or in a closet. Um, People with ADHD often will have things out and about, like on the
right.
table. And actually, they don't realize it. It's a compensatory strategy
Yeah.
because once they put it in the closet, they forget they own it. They forget it's there. Drawers are a big challenge for most people with ADHD.
Wow.
So when you see the house where, all the coats are on the pool table, that's actually a compensatory strategy. We
Right.
see where they all are. We have them out where we can see them, and that way we can pick them up. And so this book talks about, how can we do this in a way that functions for our house?
Right.
And it says it has the strategies for organization and work with your ADHD, not against it.
Right.
You can't see a professional organizer who tells you to do things that will work for a neurotypical person.
Right.
This book was written by not only a psychologist who works with ADHD, but a professional organizer. And these
Wow.
strategies are specific to people who struggle with organizing, time management, things like that. And
Yeah.
like I say, read them, like a reading snack, I call it.
Yeah.
Just read pages here or there, and they have some great strategies just to help your family
Yeah. Oh,
and yourself.
yeah. That's a great nugget.
Yeah, good.
And the out of sight, out of mind thing, I can so see that. It makes a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's what people will tell me. They'll say, "Oh, that's me." The other one are doom piles, the big piles of paper that,
Yes.
kind of get on our desk, right? And there are some great strategies for that.
Yeah.
One that works very well for a lot of people I know is with each piece of paper, put a post-it note and write the
Oh,
very next step that you need to do with this thing. You
wow.
know,
Yeah.
call, when Lydia started doing that with her post-it notes, call Jim and ask him blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That was a lot less work for her brain with
Yeah.
those doom piles.
That
So
makes a lot of sense.
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
things like that. They
Yeah.
can really change your world.
Yeah. Um, and so I wanted to ask you about the other side of what you do, even though that wasn't our main focus for today, because I think it's very important, which is the acute and chronic PTSD that you see in adults. So, how would it be that ADHD affects trauma and maybe vice versa as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of times when people are coming into me, and again, they don't always present with ADHD, but they're presenting with PTSD or very acute stress, or chronic, they might have chronic PTSD, right?
Right.
Um, so this can be an interesting we're not always sure chicken and an egg.
Oh,
But I will say that most of what we know about ADHD itself is that it's highly hereditary. I think something like
oh,
half of the people have one direct line relative who has it. So it's a very biochemical, biological, hereditary condition.
I didn't know
So
that.
yeah, yeah. So and a lot of times when people look back again, they'll say, "Oh, yeah, my grandma was, she'd talk all the time. She'd forget stuff in her house was, you know what? I think she had ADHD." So it's not uncommon. And
Yeah,
then, so that's the kind of thing. And oftentimes, the woman who has ADHD, she can usually point to like a parent or a brother or relative, a first line relative who has it. But
right.
anyway, so typically they might have underlying ADHD, but um, they can one condition can kind of amplify the other. So it
Okay.
can be important to, tease out what's going on, or at least usually we'll treat the PTSD first, right?
Yeah.
Um, Depending on what's going on with the person. But it's an interesting thing because the ADHD can magnify and make someone more susceptible to experiencing PTSD,
Oh.
because some of those core traits, especially like the heightened emotional sensitivity,
Mm,
could make someone be more likely to experience an event or an experience as traumatic, like in the body. It's
right.
neurologically and kind of your entire nervous system might experience it that way. And that's okay. That's just that can be the case. So it's something we just are mindful of.
Right.
And again, I sometimes wonder because sometimes people with the rejection sensitive dysphoria, they can remember something and they'll say, "Yeah, everyone told me this was stupid. Somebody laughed at me in grade school
Mm,
over this, but I remember that being like the end of the world." So
right.
it felt like a very traumatic experience. It might not, and I think there's a myth people have that it has to be like a threat to your life.
Right.
Certainly, we know that that's a traumatic incident has that. If that happened, that's traumatic. But
Right.
many things feel traumatic. Trauma is like a feeling in your body, right?
Mm.
So that can be what happens. And also, conversely, with how trauma can impact ADHD, there are some studies that indicate that, especially if someone experienced trauma in early childhood, like
Mm.
attachment trauma with their caregiver, um, that can even trigger somebody to it can exacerbate ADHD symptoms
Oh,
and
wow.
even increase the risk of developing ADHD.
Wow.
So that's what some research says. I'm always wondering if it was there to begin with, but I can't speak to some of the latest research. That's just not what I do.
Right.
But uh, if you already have the emotional reactivity of ADHD, trauma can heighten that.
Yeah.
So again, one can amplify the other. And I think it's just important to whatever it is you're treating, it's good to have a clinician who's informed about both conditions.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, and also just speaking briefly, um, there can be overlap between different disorders, and I don't want to
Right.
get too much into that,
Oh,
but
no, but that's important.
sure, but sometimes also some symptoms of trauma, a PTSD can look like ADHD and vice versa. Both conditions can lead someone to look like they're zoning out when they're
Mm.
listening to a person or talking to someone. With ADHD, they might be zoning out because of the trouble with focusing because of the brain-based distractibility
Right.
or just brain drain from the executive functioning. With the trauma, the zone out can be sometimes a dissociative response, something activated
Mm.
that traumatic thing in their body, and suddenly they're focusing on that feeling so much because it's seizing them,
Right.
or the memory is coming back
Right.
like a flashback, and they're zoning out because of that. So there can be some overlap. Again, helpful for a clinician to kind of tease those things out as they're working with somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. That is very important. I mean, you always want someone who like can know all of the things about everything, right? You want to go to someone that has all of the answers. So it's important, I think, to hear like when you know what your diagnosis is have to identify a therapist that can speak to all of those things for you. Kind of like you said, like finding a specialist that works best for you. So I appreciate you saying that.
Sure. And, I also tell people this is a process. You don't have to work on everything all at the same time.
Right.
let's take things, one thing at a time.
Right.
But if you suspect something else is going on, or they do, bank that for when that's something you're ready to look at or needs
Yeah.
looking at.
Yeah. Well, I think that was my last question for you. But do you have anything else you want to share?
I just want to say that my people who are bright with ADHD are some of my favorite people to work with.
Oh,
And a lot of times we do the work with trauma and life stress, right? I use a protocol called TIR,
okay.
Applied Metapsychology, and it has TIR, the traumatic incident reduction, along with life stress reduction to work through literally the trauma and life stress. But sometimes I'll do some consultation if someone is presenting also with the ADHD symptoms, like the challenges that are leading them to struggle, especially the kind of things that I see in the mom with ADHD. The other piece of advice is keeping in perspective that it's not that she's failing. I think there's an underlying, sometimes a very overt societal expectation we have. Again, the gender biases that people expect women to be their caretakers. And also in the workplace, women are often expected to do the custodial issues.
Yep.
There's also a lot of that bias. And these are all already areas where a woman with ADHD might struggle. But whereas her male counterpart, no one's expecting him to, tidy up the office or organize the notes or any of those kind of things. There are all these expectations on her that she might be noticing. And that's further putting demands on the executive functioning. So go easy on yourself and slow down. And if you have the means to make some accommodations at work, whether it's a part-time job or whether it's getting support and someone to delegate, use it. You're not getting brownie points for trying to do all of this on your own if you don't have to.
Yeah. Oh, that's great advice.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, thank you so, so much for being here. I think this has been an incredibly helpful episode. And I think a lot of people are going to take many, many things from this. So I appreciate you being here.
Good. I hope so. Oh, one other thing. And then I'll stop.
No, you're fine.
A great resource is chadd.org.
Oh, yes.
CHADD.org.
Okay.
I think that's one of the largest, if not the largest, organization for children and adults with ADHD in this country. And one of the largest chapters is in the DC area. And they have all kinds of, online articles that are not clinical. They really speak to strategies like how do you deal with procrastivity, which is a tendency for people with ADHD. And other great resources, Attitude Mag, ADD, attitudemag.com. And they are, I think, a function of WebMD, similar. And they have great podcasts, articles, webinars. So there are all kinds of resources out there, along with behavioral health experts. So I'd say good luck. You don't have to go through all this alone.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put those in the show notes so people can find those too. So those are great. You said Attitude Mag, ADDITUDEMAG.
Yes. Yes. attitudemag.org or attitudemag.com. I'm going to look up which one it is.
Great. And I'll put it in the show notes and it'll be, people can find it there.
Yeah. And they're great. Those webinars and magazine articles written by and for people with ADHD. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, figuring out what strategies to do, what your experience is. It's a whole community out there.
That's awesome.
Helping. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was a good thing to add in here.
Good. Well, I'm glad. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I hope this helps people.
Yeah, me too. I think it will.
Good.
Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.